Well, thank you, Jen. Very generous words. Really appreciate that. So I think we will start with an icebreaker activity. No, we won't be doing that. So, the Homunculus Paradox. A homunculus is a little person. That's what it means in Latin. And you might be thinking, what's that got to do with anything? And so part of my job in this talk is to explain what that has got to do with anything. So that's one of the things that I'm going to do. But before I get into that, oh, there's my books that Jen mentioned. This, by the way, the new screens, these two screens, it makes this room, those of you that have been to ResearchED before here will have noticed that there's a sort of dead spot in the middle where you had to look at that or that one, and we've got these here, so this is quite nice. Okay, so I'm going to do my caveats first. So this is George Box. He is a British statistician, and he's talking about statistical models. And he says all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think this is a very profound point. I think people get mistaken about science all the time. People expect science to be a complete and full description of the world. And that's not how science works at all. Science is about making models, and those models are meant to be as simple as possible so that we can understand them. And they're meant to make accurate predictions. That's the value of them. A scientific model is valuable if it makes accurate predictions. It doesn't have to be really complicated, and it is not intended to be a full description of the world. And I'll give you an example, because it won't surprise you to know that today I'm going to draw on cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory's model of the mind. And cognitive load theory's model of the mind does not include something that definitely exists. If you read about cognitive load theory, you won't see many references to sensory memory. Sensory memory exists, and it is important. It's just not important in terms of the kinds of predictions that cognitive load theory makes. So the model of the mind that is used by cognitive load theory is a simplification. It's not a full description of reality. And I'm making that caveat because whatever I present to you today is a simplification. It's a model. It has some value, or I wouldn't be presenting it, but it's not meant to be a complete description of everything, like no scientific model is meant to be. And then oh, wait a bit, I jumped over one. Oh, going too far. There you go, a bit of a preview there. My second bit of throat clearing, I suppose, is the unpleasant way that people describe it. I don't like that metaphor. I won't use it again. My second bit is this. So this is the story that you might have been told at Sunday school or something like that, if that's where you've been. There'll be people in the audience who have various different philosophical beliefs, religious beliefs. And we're talking about a model of the mind here. And models of the mind can be a little bit threatening because if, for instance, you believe in a soul that persists after death, then you can feel a little uncomfortable when we start talking about models of the mind. So I'm going to tell this Sunday school story just to put that in context a little bit. So, you've probably heard it. A man falls off a cliff into the sea. And his fellows see him, and they're trying to help him. So they throw him a rubber ring. And he doesn't reach for the rubber ring because he says, God will save me. And so they get a boat and they row out in the boat, but he doesn't move towards the boat because he says, God will save me. And then they get a helicopter, and that's what this is. Helicopter goes out to him, doesn't reach for the helicopter, God will save me. But unfortunately, the man dies. And he goes to the afterlife. And he meets God. And he says to God, he says, why didn't you save me? And God says, what are you talking about? I sent you a rubber ring, a boat, and a helicopter. The point of that story is that whatever is true in the physical world doesn't have to necessarily conflict with your deeper philosophical or spiritual beliefs. That's a bit heavy, that. But I think it's an important thing to just lay out, because when we're talking about the mind, we're talking about something that's very personal to everybody. Okay, so the homunculus. What we have here is what I mean by a homunculus. So how does the mind work? And we can only really approach this through various metaphors that we can use. And this is a naive metaphor that you might have maybe thought of as a child. It's the metaphor used in the movie franchise Inside Out. So what is controlling the person? There's a little person inside controlling the person, yes? So what's making you do things? There's a little person inside your head pulling levers, turning dials, making you do what you do. And you might be thinking that's not how the mind works, and you'd be right. And you might be thinking, well, what has this got to do with anything? Because no one would think that's how the mind works. And you'd be wrong. Because in a funny sort of way, this is how some people picture how the mind works, and we will get to that. In the Enlightenment, when people were building clocks and things like that and clockwork stuff, one little development was the development of automata. And automata were essentially little clockwork robots, I suppose. So a very famous one was this duck. Get this right, it's true this is. There was a duck, and it would waddle across the floor, it would peck bits of food, digest the food, and then excrete little pellets. And it was all done by clockwork, this clockwork duck. It's automata. And what I've got on the screen is perhaps the most famous of all, except it's not. This is a hoax automata. So this was presented to people as, it was called the Mechanical Turk. So it was supposed to be a clockwork controlled person who would play chess. And so people would go to the exhibition. I forget which exhibition it was at. Doesn't matter. You don't need to know that. They go to the exhibition and they play chess against this thing. It was a wonder because it was supposed to be controlled by clockwork. But actually, it was a hoax because there was literally a person inside controlling it. So that's a great analogy for the homunculus there. You've got the person actually inside controlling what the automata does. And why am I mentioning this? Well, at that time, how would people describe how the mind works? Well, they'd go to what they know. So you'd have descriptions of the mind that would draw on ideas such as how watches work or clockwork or things like that. So people would picture the mind as consisting of a series of sort of cogs and levers and things like that. And that's what was going around. And we even use that analogy, that metaphor now. We talk about the cogs whirring when you're thinking hard. And we would use that metaphor for what the mind is. But we have moved on since then. And so what the analogy that people draw on often now for the mind, the most popular analogy is probably that of a computer. Makes sense, doesn't it? Because computers do things that we do. And this has been an extraordinarily fruitful area for cognitive science, modelling the mind as a computer. It's incredibly fruitful. So from about the 60s onwards, that's what people started to do. They say, well, we don't know how the mind works, but we know how computers work because we've built them. So let's assume the mind works like a computer. Let's use that as our model, and let's see if we can figure out how the mind works. Interestingly, there's this fellow called Guy Claxton. We had a reaction to Guy Claxton. Guy Claxton is a guy in the UK who, when I was at a school in a different life, we did something called Building Learning Power. And that was Guy Claxton's program, and he came to the school and he presented this thing. And what you had to do is there were these learning muscles, and you had to exercise your different learning muscles because then the learning muscles would grow stronger. And at the end of every lesson, only used to happen usually if you're being observed, you would have to ask the students, which learning muscles did you use today? That's Guy Claxton's Building Learning Power. And Guy Claxton is not a fan of cognitive load theory. Doesn't like it at all. And he's written a book where he tries to rebut cognitive load theory. And one of the things he says is cognitive load theory is wrong, it's defunct, because it relies on modelling the mind as a computer. Now, Guy Claxton hasn't actually read much cognitive load theory, it seems, because cognitive load theory explicitly rejects this idea of modelling the mind as a computer. So although some of the ideas that cognitive load theory is drawn on this tradition of cognitive science that did model the mind as a computer, this extraordinarily rich tradition, cognitive load theory explicitly rejects that idea. And I'm going to explain why. So, famous scientist is at a conference. I thought this is an apocryphal story. It's really interesting when you look at these things. I was convinced this was Richard Feynman. And I tried to look it up, and no such thing ever happened to Richard Feynman. And it's just one of these stories that people tell. So I'm going to say a famous scientist. He's at a conference, this famous scientist, and he gives a talk on perhaps evolution, what Jen was talking about. He gives a talk on evolution and the world and the universe and the Big Bang and, I don't know, any of those sorts of things. And he's finished his talk, and someone comes up to him and says, "Very interesting talk, Professor, but you got that wrong." And the professor goes, "Oh, really? What? You're talking about the Big Bang and all this sort of stuff. It's not true. The Earth is on the back of a turtle." And the professor says, "And what's the turtle standing on then?" And the person says, "Oh, you're not going to catch me out that way. It's turtles all the way down." And this illustrates an idea called an infinite regress. An infinite regress. And it's the sort of idea that people think about, you know, and it's a problem for this homunculus idea. And it's a problem for the computer model of the mind too, this infinite regress, which we're going to get to. So, this is a model of the mind. And what I'm presenting to you is a model of the mind that was presented by Baddeley and Hitch in 1974. And we've got there working memory and long-term memory. And working memory is this bit, okay? And Baddeley and Hitch proposed that the working memory consists of a central executive which controls these other things: phonological loop, episodic buffer, visuospatial, sketchpad. And this central executive controls those things. And the central executive idea comes from the computer model, because a computer has something called a central processing unit, a CPU, which controls what the computer does. It controls what resources the computer deploys. And so using that idea, Baddeley and Hitch came up with this model. So you've got the central executive, it controls the phonological loop, which is about verbal information, episodic buffer, so remembering things for a few seconds, and visuospatial sketchpad, which is images and things like that. But this model has a problem, and it's the homunculus problem. So we're going to get to the first real key point here. Why is the homunculus model of the mind absurd? Well, it doesn't take much thinking about this to realise it leads to an infinite regress. If there is a person inside your head controlling what you're doing, then what is controlling the person? Is there a person inside its head controlling what it's doing? And if so, is there a person inside that person's head controlling what they're doing? And so it runs into absurdity very quickly. And that's why you might think, well, no one would propose such a model. The problem is that the computer model of the mind does just that. If your mind is controlled by a central executive that decides what you're going to do, what's controlling the central executive? Is there a central executive inside the central executive? And is there a central executive inside that? Computers solve this problem because they're running a program. So ultimately the program is being executed by the central processing unit. And the program comes from us. Even in the most complex machine learning scenarios where we don't even know what the eventual program looks like in AI or something like that, we started that process. We designed it from the start. What controls the central processing unit in us if this is the model of the mind? It's not clear. And you can try and fudge this and you can try and get around it and you can sort of appeal to evolution and things like that. But it is still a central problem. It's a problem of infinite regress. And that's a problem for the computer model of the mind. And this is what Guy Claxton argued. When he argued against cognitive load theory, he made exactly this point. Unfortunately for him, cognitive load theory doesn't model the mind as a computer. And that's quite important. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to do a task. And this is the simplest task anyone is ever going to ask you to do. Because it doesn't even involve doing something, it involves not doing something. And I'm not going to ask you not to breathe or something like that. It is quite achievable. You've got to not do something, and you've got to not do the thing that I want you to not do for about 30 seconds. That's all. Okay? So the task is coming up. Go.
Don't think of a white bear. 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 Don't think of a
So hopefully you're all successful at that task. It's hard, isn't it? You didn't want to think of a white bear. So if the computer model is right, your central executive would have been telling you not to think of it. But that's not what happened. And most people in this room, unless they have extraordinary sort of meditative powers, probably ended up thinking of something like a polar bear. Why is that? Well, it's because in the model I would propose, the model that cognitive load theory would propose, that it's not a central executive that is controlling what we're thinking of. It is an interaction between our long-term memory and the environment, mediated by working memory. That's what controls our attention. It's a really important idea because it demonstrates the power of the environment. And this is really important just in the everyday business of teaching. If we want kids to pay attention to certain things that we want them to learn, and often they don't pay attention, and why is that? And I think one of the big problems we have in teaching is the fundamental attribution error, where we assume that everything is willful. So the fundamental attribution error, for those that don't know, is this idea that, if someone cuts in front of you in traffic, it's because they're a bad person. They're evil. They're one of those arrogant people. They probably drive a BMW. If you cut in front of someone in traffic, it's because you're in a rush. It's because of circumstances. It's because of the environment. And when we think about kids and their behavior, we often cut to the sort of personality of the student, their sort of innate type. Oh, they're a good student, they're a bad student, that sort of thing. Whereas often there's an awful lot that is due to the environment. So by rearranging the environment, you can actually change the way that kids are paying attention. You can change a lot of what's going on in the classroom. And so that's really quite a useful, quite purposeful, quite hopeful thing to be aware of. It's also, this interaction between the environment and long-term memory is also how jokes work. So jokes are usually the result of, your attention has to catch up. Something triggers your long-term memory, in maybe a surprising way. Your attention catches up and you are surprised, and that's a joke. So I'm going to try this. So this is a Norm Macdonald joke. So if you know it, apologies. You're really worried now, aren't you? Because I'm going to tell a joke. Yeah. Everyone's nervous. Okay. I am too. It's okay. So a moth walks into a podiatrist. And the moth says to the podiatrist, "Doc," don't know why he calls the podiatrist Doc. But that's Norm Macdonald's fault, that is. That's what he says anyway in the original joke. So he says, "Doc, you've got to help me." And the podiatrist says, "Really? What's wrong?" He says, "Look, I go to work every day. I'm on my feet all day." And the podiatrist says, "Really?" He says, "Yes. And my boss, Sergei Vladimirovich, he drives me really hard. And I think the only thing in the world that makes him truly happy is telling me what to do, ordering me around. And I go home and go to sleep and wake up next to my wife, and I think, where did all that time go? We were a young couple, we were beautiful, flying around at night, and now we're older, and it's mundane, but it's just routine. What happened to the young couple that were in love?" And I think of my beautiful Elena Petrovna, my daughter. She was so gorgeous. We used to play together. She used to giggle. Now all she does, she just screams at me. Anything I say to her, she screams at me. That's all she does. And my son, Alexei Petrovich, I used to take him to the football every weekend. He and I would go to the football, and we'd enjoy each other's company, and we'd do DIY together. And now he's away, he's left home, he never calls me. It's as if that never happened, as if that never existed. And the podiatrist says, "Gosh," he says, "I think you need a psychologist. You know, I'm a podiatrist. Why did you walk in here?" And the moth says, "Because the light was on." Jokes. Okay, so it wasn't that bad. We were all nervous. It wasn't that bad. Okay, so this is what I am proposing. Just doing a time check. Yes, okay. And I say I'm proposing this. I'm not proposing this. This is Swella Ayres and forgotten the. Yeah. Anyway, it's not my model. It's what they proposed in their book, Cognitive Load Theory. John Sweller, Paul Ayres, and I've forgotten who the third author is. It must be Kaluga. Anyway, I don't know. So what's actually controlling what we pay attention to in our working memory is an interaction between a stimulus from the environment and our long-term memory. So I've already said that makes the environment extremely important, but it also makes the long-term memory extremely important. We often think in cognitive load theory that there's this sort of barrier sitting between the long-term memory and the environment, and that's working memory. And we often talk about it being a bottleneck, being very restricted. You can only process about 3 or 4 items at a time in working memory. And that's all true. But all of those restrictions disappear with knowledge that is held in long-term memory. This is our superpower. So those restrictions, that barrier, falls away, and we can instantly engage, without any conscious effort at all, concepts that sit in our long-term memory. So, I'm going to suggest that of these three models so far, actually the one that probably is the best metaphor is way back in the Enlightenment and the cogs one. Because it's not accurate, but the idea of the mind being a sort of machine for processing things, but it's just a whole load of cogs, is probably slightly more accurate than the computer model with its central processing unit. So, what you're looking at now is the homunculus model of long-term memory. So this is how we often imagine long-term memory to be. So it's like a library, full of books, memories. If you see the movie Inside Out, they're like little orbs that you can sort of pull off the shelves, the memories. And this is what we often think long-term memory to be. And we imagine this little homunculus again, wandering through, selecting the memories, selecting the things that we want to pay attention to. We know that can't be right, because we know that leads to an infinite regress. So this cannot be how long-term memory works. So this common sort of idea of long-term memory can't be the way that long-term memory works. And why I like the cogs idea is that whatever is in your mind is what you're thinking with. So knowledge is not inert. Knowledge is not a load of books or files or little orbs that are all stored on shelves. Knowledge is what you're actually thinking with. So the things that you've got in your long-term memory are active. They're what you're using to think with. Knowledge is what you think with. That's one of our mantras here at Clarendon. That's one of the things that we talk to staff about a lot when we're talking about this sort of stuff. And this is the example that I often go to. So, 3x equals 18. Working memory is extremely limited. We've already talked about that. We can process about 3, maybe 4 items at a time in our working memory. How many items are here? Well, there are at least 4 symbols on the screen. Well, there's 5 symbols on the screen. There's a 3, an x, an equals, and an 18. But the 18 is also made of 2 symbols. But there's more than that going on here. There is a relationship between all those elements. So there's actually a missing multiplication sign between the 3 and the x. That's actually 3 times x. And there's a principle that it's actually very difficult to teach students. The principle of balance, the idea that what is on the left of that equation is equivalent to what's on the right of the equation. So if you do something to one side of the equation, you've got to do the same thing to the other side to keep everything the same. So if you were teaching a novice this from scratch, I mean, first of all, if you're teaching it from scratch, they wouldn't even know how the 1 and the 8 represent something. So you'd have to teach them that. So you would easily overwhelm their working memory. If you tried to teach someone from scratch how to solve a problem like this, if they had no knowledge in long-term memory. Yet those of you who, in the audience, who have studied algebra to, I don't know, 8th grade or something, which would be a lot of you, within a second of me putting that on the screen, will have known that x is 6. So think about how extraordinarily complex that is, how difficult it would be to teach that from scratch, element by element, and yet how instantaneously you were able to engage your long-term memory, probably with very, very little effort. You probably didn't even, it was a bit like the white bear. It was probably even involuntary. Didn't even think, I wonder what x is, let's find out. It just appeared. And that's an interaction between a stimulus from the environment, which I've provided, and your long-term memory. And it happened almost instantaneously with no effort at all. So this illustrates the other side of that equation, the power of long-term memory. So I'm doing a weird thing for a talk on cognitive load theory. I'm saying we often focus on the working memory component, but actually the environment's very important, and long-term memory is very, very important. And it's an interaction between those two things that is critical. Now, have a read of that. I don't know how many people in this room follow baseball. Probably some, because usually when I ask this question, there's usually some people who follow baseball. And if you follow baseball, you will have understood that passage. If you don't follow baseball, you will have not really understood it. And it's an interesting example, and we often use sport for these examples, because it's an example where you can understand all the vocabulary, you know what all the words mean, but you still can't build a mental picture of what it's talking about. So if you don't know baseball, you can't really picture what went in for their first four batters, went ahead, sorry, when their first four batters reached off Adam Wainwright, reached. I can't picture what that's supposed to look like. I imagine it's something to do with swinging a bat or something, but I don't know. And this is a very common experience for students in schools, because they will be confronted with passages where they can decode all the words might even be in their vocabulary, but they can't really picture what's going on. And a common response of ours is to try to train the homunculus. So we say what the problem here is that these kids have poor reading comprehension. So what we will do is we will improve their reading comprehension. So we'll make the little homunculus inside their head better at reading comprehension, and then they'll be able to read it. But it's obvious in this case that it's not a homunculus issue. It's not the little person isn't very good at reading comprehension, it's that they lack knowledge. They don't lack sufficient knowledge in long-term memory to make sense of what they're reading. And this, in essence, is the argument for a knowledge-rich curriculum. Now, I'm going to put a caveat out there, though, before I don't want people to run away with this. One of the most robust findings in all of educational research is that teaching kids reading comprehension strategies is effective. It works. It really does. We can speculate on how and why and all that sort of stuff, but teaching reading comprehension strategies works. It could be that it provides a sort of one-off benefit, and there certainly seems to be little value in constantly practicing them. So these strategies are not really skills, because if they're a skill, if you practiced it, you get better at it. But what they are, they're little, well, Dan Willingham calls them tricks. You could call them tips for answering reading comprehension questions, but they work at that level. They do work. So people shouldn't go away and say, okay, we're going to stop teaching our kids reading comprehension strategies, because of all the findings in education research, that's probably the most solid that they work. But they're probably not enough. What we're teaching kids when we're teaching them reading comprehension strategies is a few tricks or techniques for dealing with those sorts of questions. The vast bulk of what they need, though, to comprehend text is relevant background knowledge. So if we want students to be able to comprehend a range of texts, so the E.D. Hirsch uses the example of the New York Times. So if someone in America wants to be an engaged citizen, they need to be able to read and understand something like the New York Times. What would they need to know? What is the information that is not spelt out in the New York Times that would need to be in their long-term memory for them to make sense of it? And that's the origin of Hirsch's core knowledge curriculum. And of course, it has lots of attendant problems, because for historical reasons, if you ask that question and you ask what is the knowledge that people know, you get a set of knowledge that is often quite centered around European ideas and characters and dead white European men. And so that creates a political problem. What do we do with that? Do we say we are going to teach this knowledge so that to be able to engage in society in an educated way, they need to know this stuff? Or actually we want to disrupt it. We want to change society so that in order to engage in society, you need to know different stuff. And it's a bit of a tension. And this is why when I've written about this, I think this is not a decision that individual teachers should be making in their classrooms. This is something that should be decided at a state level, in a transparent way where different stakeholders with different views argue it out, and we reach some sort of compromise that suits nobody, and that would be a sign that we're probably about right. That's what you would need to do. And I think we need, in Australia, a much more serious approach to the curriculum. The Australian curriculum that we have largely ducks any of those issues. It just doesn't specify things. So leaves it up to individual teachers. Where it does specify things, it's extremely unambitious, very lightweight. If you teach explicitly, you teach efficiently, you teach effectively, you can teach far more and in far more depth than the Australian curriculum, and you should be doing that. That's what you should be seeking to do. I've got a quote for this one. I tried to memorise it, I couldn't. Well, I probably could have, but cost benefit, you know. So Carl Bareiter is, he was involved in Project Follow Through, which was the big program in the US at the end of the 60s. So they had this thing called Head Start. Head Start? Yeah, I think so. And that was like about early childhood care. And then they wanted to extend that into early education, and they called it Follow Through. And he took it to Congress, and it was like hundreds of billions of dollars program, and they cut it to like a few tens of billions of dollars, millions, I don't know, whatever, amounts of money got cut. And so you could no longer deliver this program to everybody. So they had a decision, what we're going to do with this funding? And they decided to use it to run an experiment. So instead of delivering high quality early education programs to everyone, they got the different providers to deliver it in certain pockets, and then they tested which programs worked the best. It was a big experiment. It was a messy experiment. People who don't like it. So there's two types of the education establishment sort of subscribes to this romantic ideology, and there are two types of education professors in that establishment: those that have never heard of Project Follow Through, and those that have heard that it was a big and messy experiment and we shouldn't pay too much attention to it. However, it was the largest education experiment ever run, and a guy called Zig Engelman put together a program called Direct Instruction, DISTAR, and that program, where that was run, outperformed all the other programs. And it was labelled a basic skills program, which is really unfortunate that it got that label. It was labelled that because it focused on basic skills. But the kids in the direct instruction program not only outperformed the kids in the other programs on basic skills, they outperformed the kids in the other programs on reading comprehension, on mathematical problem solving, on self-esteem. Some of these programs were designed specifically to boost kids' self-esteem, and direct instruction beat those programs at boosting kids' self-esteem. But the fact that it was labelled a basic skills program has led to this ongoing misconception that, direct instruction, that's great if you want to teach kids basic skills, but I'm into teaching more highfalutin stuff. I'm into training the homunculus. Yes? I'm into doing that. I don't want to just teach basic skills. And so I need this other kind of a thing. And it sort of fed into that. Anyway, that's all irrelevant because this isn't anything to do with Project Follow Through. But later on, Carl Bareiter wrote a book called Education of Mind in the Knowledge Age. It was the early 2000s. And he's got a chapter on critical thinking, creativity, and other virtues. And this is how he launches that chapter. Nobel laureates, captains of industry, cabinet ministers, school superintendents. Any one of them is likely to end a commencement address or a discourse on the current crisis by declaring that schools have got to teach students how to think. The words roll easily off the tongue, and the speakers show not the slightest doubt that the words mean something. But do they? Why do we never hear about the need to teach students to digest? Like thinking, digestion is a vital natural process. It exhibits large individual differences and is influenced by psychological and environmental factors. So the point he's making is that it sounds very impressive to say we're going to teach kids how to think. We're going to teach them thinking skills. We're going to teach them critical thinking. But it doesn't actually mean anything. We think anyway. We're just thinking all the time. What we need is to teach them stuff to think with. We need to give them tools to think with. And what are those tools? What do they look like? They look like different forms of knowledge. And when I use that term knowledge, let me be clear. I'm not just talking about lists of facts, dates, names, things like that. Knowledge can include all sorts of stuff. So if I say to you the word disinterested, okay? Many people use that word wrong. They use that word incorrectly to mean uninterested, whereas disinterested means that I am making a judgment on something that I don't have a financial interest in. So I'm a legitimately objective person to be making this decision because I don't have some financial or other interest in the outcome of the decision. Now, I just had to explain that. I had to use a lot of words to explain that. But we've packaged all those ideas up in one word, disinterested. And if anyone knows it, knows how to use it, knows the meaning of it, that's very powerful. And that's knowledge. So knowledge isn't just, the date of some battle or the arrival of the first fleet or whatever. Knowledge is a whole lot of tools for thinking with. You can say things quite concisely, like the concept of democracy, for instance. It means a lot of different things, quite complicated. But we can use that word, and if we have a common understanding of what it means, if we have some shared knowledge, we can say very meaningful things about it. And this leads to the question, well, what are schools for? Why did we invent schools? Schools are not a human universal. I was at a talk last week where the speakers were talking about this idea of human universals. It's a really important idea. So a human universal is something that is present in every culture, every human culture on Earth. And it's actually getting more difficult to discern them now because cultures are getting more connected, so most things get sort of culturally transmitted between cultures now. But there are still cultures that are quite isolated. And anthropologists study them, and you find that in any human culture there'll be a religion. Every culture has some version of religion. Schools, formal schooling, is not a human universal. There are many traditional societies that don't organise kids into groups and instruct them in things. They just don't. They do teach, there's definitely education in all human, that's a human universal, but in some traditional societies that looks more like an apprenticeship, apprentice to an adult, rather than a formal schooling. So why did we invent schools? What are they for? Well, they're not for training the non-existent homunculus, yes? Yet that's how we often treat them. We talk about we've got to teach critical thinking, we've got to teach creativity, we've got to teach problem-solving skills, we've got to teach collaborative skills. This is all trying to train the non-existent homunculus to be a better homunculus. And if you don't believe me that this is what we're trying to do, here is a section of the Australian curriculum. These are the general capabilities in the Australian curriculum. Literacy and numeracy, I don't know why you'd think they're general. They seem quite specific to literacy and numeracy. IT, critical and creative thinking. Personal and social capability. Now, I can think of things that it would be useful to teach kids that you could call personal social capability, but they're specific things that relate to specific circumstances. They're not a general capability. We're not training the homunculus here. So what are schools for? This is a 5,000-year-old. Oh, is it 5,000 years old? Well, I don't know. I don't know whether I'm asking whether that specific one is 5,000 years old. This form of writing is 5,000 years old. So what happened was in ancient Sumer, people would be trading. I don't know, and I'm not going to get this quite right, but just bear with. You can look up how I was wrong later if you want. People would be trading like cows and things like that. And what they would do to make a record of that, they would take beads and they would put those beads in clay, and then they bake the clay in the sun. And then when the time came to sort of check that transaction, how many cows did it give you? You break open the clay, and you can then see, and no one's tampered with it because you've broken it open. And then what they would do is they'd put marks on the surface of the clay to show how many beads they'd put in there. And then they realised they didn't need to put beads in there. And from this evolved the first form of writing in Eurasia. Writing has been invented multiple times in different places, but the first writing in Eurasia, ancient Sumerian. And this is an ancient Sumerian tablet. It's called cuneiform. The writing is made by impressing a stylus into a piece of clay. That's 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years is not a long time. Humans have been around. In our current form, we don't know exactly, but you know it's around about 100,000 years. But we've been evolving for millions of years. Presumably, during that time, we've been talking to each other in maybe less sophisticated forms a million years ago than we do now, but we've been talking to each other. So oral language has been a constant. That means that there has been sufficient time for evolution to have acted on oral language, so that we essentially have like a predisposition to learn oral language, which is why no one takes little kids. Some speech pathologists are going to disagree with me on this, but very specific issues, yes, but in general, we don't take little kids, put them in classrooms and say, right, you need to put your tongue here to make the S sound. They learn it through immersion, they learn it through discovery. But we do seem to have to bring them together and put them and say, this is how you write a letter S. Why? Well, writing is not a human universal. It's a recent invention. In the last 5,000 years, it's not even the case that everyone's been writing. That was the preserve of a tiny clerical class. Mass literacy is only a couple of hundred years old. Even if the ability to read and write made you sexier, made you have more children, made you more evolutionary fit, there's just not been enough time, and that's debatable whether it does. There's not been enough time for evolution to have acted on that. So unfortunately, if you want to learn to read and write, and all the applications of reading and writing, which is what we call academic subjects, you haven't evolved to do that. It's unnatural. And so we invented schools to teach those things that we haven't evolved to pick up through immersion. Which is why it is perverse to then try and teach things in schools through immersion. Because the whole point of a school is that it's to teach these hard things that you really have to use the brute force of practice over and over again, retrieval. Bring it out of your long-term memory, put it back, bring it out, put it back, over and over and over again until we can eventually do these things. Because they're not natural. There are two ways that we can get knowledge into long-term memory. This is according to cognitive load theory. These are the two ways. And you might disagree with one of them, but I will cover that. Borrowing and reorganizing versus random generate and test. So borrowing and reorganizing is our human superpower. It's our ability to get knowledge from someone else. So no, we don't have to start from scratch. Every generation of humans can pick up where the last one left off. We don't have to invent language. We don't have to. That's already there. We can learn that from others. We can take that from others, and this is why we have these complex cultures that other animals don't have. Because we have communication, and that communication is sophisticated and enables me to take what's in my long-term memory and give it to you. Now, you don't just file it exactly like that. You do a bit of work with it. It might be in a slightly different form, but that's essentially what we do. The other is random generate and test. Okay? So you don't know where the pinata is. You've got it, right? Now that's much more laborious. That's discovery learning. This is what research scientists do. Yes? Because the reason they're doing research is it's knowledge that no one else has yet. So we've got to figure it out. And you might say, yeah, but it's not random. Research scientists are not just randomly doing stuff. What about don't they have educated guesses? Well, what does that look like? So here's a diagram where I'm trying to explain what that looks like. So you're doing you're using your long-term memory until you get to a point where it runs out. And then you use random generate and guess. So, generate and test. So here we've got knowledge, and my knowledge is like a sort of wave front. And that's knowledge relevant to the problem. Where at the boundary of that, where that runs out, I've got to start using random generate and test. If I've got more knowledge, I start closer to the goal state. So it's easier for me to reach it. So we can see that the acquisition of new knowledge is by random generate and test. And what we mean by an educated guess is just that we can surf knowledge closer to the goal if we've got more of it than if we have less. How do we know what knowledge to teach? I never quite stick to my plan. I've sort of prefigured this already. This is the political argument. That there, I haven't done this bit. That there is a BBC microcomputer. BBC microcomputer. When I was at school, back in the 1920s, these were the thing. BBC microcomputers, they were the future. They were white heat of technology. They were cool. Everyone, let's get to the computer room, let's go on computers, let's do some stuff on computers. Computers. I had a lesson where I sat in the computer lab and I was taught how to use a word processor, how to name the files, how to justify text in this word processor, what commands I had to use to do that. No doubt my teachers thought that they were preparing me for the future. Yes? However, as you all know, all of that is completely useless because computers don't work like that anymore, word processors don't work like that anymore. And often the thing that we think is cutting edge, the new thing that we want to teach kids has that property. It's going to be obsolete soon because of its very nature as technology. What won't change very quickly is grammar or the rules of algebra. So our best bets in a classroom is not getting that iPods out or the whatever it is now, the ear pods or whatever. It's not that. It's the things that have endured. Those are our best bets. If we want to teach kids something now that will be useful to them in 15 years' time, our best bet is the things that have been useful for a long time up until now. Because they've obviously got some property that is conserved. Now, I can't tell you that we definitely are not going to all decide to change the rules of grammar in 5 years' time, but it seems unlikely. However, the way the latest bit of technology works probably will change, and change quite radically within the next 5 years. So it's not our best bet. I would also make an argument for powerful knowledge. Now, the people from Clarendon, I feel so sorry for the people from Clarendon, because I don't know how many times I've made this particular analogy. But anyway, here we go. What do I mean by powerful knowledge? So if you're an English teacher and you're deciding which text to teach, you can teach the latest young adult novel. That might be pretty cool. It might talk about social issues that you find particularly engaging and relevant. You could teach 1984. 1984 has knowledge within it that sort of exists outside of 1984. It sort of expands out from the book. I've got an image here on the screen of CCTV cameras. And people often talk about, CCTV cameras as being a big brother. And that comes from the novel 1984. So 1984 speaks to a whole load of things outside the confines of the novel. And I would argue that if we're selecting powerful knowledge, we're getting the best bang for our buck, because we're not just selecting a text to teach, we're selecting something that has these wider implications. Now again, and this is the bit I prefigured, if that's all you do, you will end up with a very white European curriculum and canon that you're teaching. And again, where does the exact balance lie? Well, we would disrupt that a little at Clarendon, so we don't just choose things on this basis. We have other criteria that we would use. We would look at the diversity of texts and authors and things like that. But we're trying to balance those things. And again, this shouldn't be down to individual teachers or even a school like ours. This should be something that we have panels of people working on, disagreeing about, and coming up with a solution that no one likes. That's the way that we should be doing this. So, we got there, eventually. To summarise, there is no little person in your heads. Okay? Now, you might think, I never thought there was a little person in my head. But a lot of the ideas that we have in education are based logically on the idea that there is a little person in your head, that we can train to be a better little person, better at thinking. Knowledge is what we think with. There is no thought independent of something to think about. School is about building that knowledge, and it's about building this knowledge, this specific academic body of knowledge that we haven't evolved to simply acquire. That's what the technology of schools was designed to do. That's why we built them. So we shouldn't act as if we don't know that. And we shouldn't do things that are at odds with that purpose. Trying to make academic knowledge natural or assuming that it's natural, surrounding kids with books and reading to them and hoping that they'll sort of pick up reading in the same way that they pick up language is a bad idea. And we, us here, until they create the Commission of the Great and Good who can decide this for us, we have a responsibility to think about that. If you're just teaching the Australian curriculum, it's not enough. So you're going to have to add to that. And at the moment, that decision rests with you and your schools. And that's a profound responsibility and something that deserves thinking about. Thank you.